You're muted, Kai.
Hi, can everyone here see me and see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so I'll just quickly introduce myself. My name is Kai Blumberg. I'm an ontologist at the BICO-DEMO, so the Biological and Chemical Oceanography Data Management Office at Woods Hole. And I'm also a PhD candidate at the University of Arizona. And I was asked to give a talk here about just kind of some ontology principles, tools, and workflows, and kind of the information and tooling ecosystem around those things that might be of interest to this cluster. So I've kind of tailored it towards soils. And I'm glad Mark is here because he can also take some of the heat, and some of the slides are modified from him. So he could be an author on this if he wanted to be, but he said no. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Okay. And so just briefly talking about FAIR, I'm sure many of you have heard about it probably more times than you would like, but just to keep going with it anyway. So when we say FAIR, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, etc., it means several things to different people. It means that the data should be accessible, but it also means that the vocabularies should be fair. And then not only should the data and vocabularies be fair to humans, but also to machine systems that search for them as well. So here I'll be talking briefly about FAIR and the components of it with regard to vocabulary specifically. So in terms of a findable vocabulary, and thank you, Mark, for the help with some of these slides. So findable vocabularies, can terms be found or discovered just in a glossary or on the web? Do terms have, unique identifiers? Like, for example, dereferenceable HTTPS or HTTP hierarchies, like a web link? Like, can we actually go there and we click and we actually get more information from it? Or can a machine search and go and get it from there? What about terms in terms of vocabularies? How are they doing in terms of being defined and being findable in terms of more information about the term? For example, like, are they just minimally labeled? Or do they have more information like annotation properties, which give other descriptors such as comments or definitions, etc., preferably within some other formal vocabulary system that can be machine searchable? And finally, are terms hierarchically arranged? For example, following practices of, our like hierarchies, like subclasses, so that they can actually be searched for and found in that way. So just a brief nod to a counterexample of this. So I'm sure that I'm not super familiar with the soils world, but my understanding is that the Glossus Discovery Hub is one of the important places where people go to look. And just kind of having briefly looked at it with, thank you again, Mark, for the tip, and basically looking at their vocabularies there. And, I unfortunately hate to point out that, they don't really, it's kind of all the opposite of all the things I just stated. So they are minimally labeled. It's just a label. There's no HTTPRRI, as far as I could tell anyway, on their site to where these terms go to that might link them to other annotations or definitions, etc. They're not following a hierarchy. So this is the kind of thing where having some sort of fair vocabulary would make a system like Glossus be able to do a lot more things. So that's just kind of a thing to think about for future notes. In terms of accessibility, are terms behind a paywall, or are they actually open access? Are they only in hard copy, or, for example, buried in a book or glossary or a PDF? A nod out to Simon Cox's Australian Soil Classification Guide, which is literally sitting in my drawer because he sent it to me and I dragged it with me when I moved. But unfortunately, as far as I know, perhaps he's made some progress on a representation of this, but this would be an example of something that might just be buried in a book or glossary or PDF. And can the terms, and because we want to do is for the terms to be accessible, we want them to be acquired and referenced through the web, again, via a dereferenceable IRI. And then finally, also, do they, to be accessible, and do they also follow kind of some standard structures or syntaxes? There's a lot of these. Some examples such as SCOS, OWL, RDF, OBO format, etc. Interoperability. This is kind of one of the big ones in terms of what vocabularies contribute to FAIR. So from the FAIR paper itself, they define interoperability as kind of metadata or data, as in the vocabularies that themselves are a formal, accessible, shared, and broadly applicable language for knowledge representation. And that the data itself should use these vocabularies in order to follow the FAIR principles. And the data and the vocabularies themselves need to follow the FAIR principles, like I've been saying. And that, you know, these vocabularies and data help, it would be better for them to be providing qualified references to other metadata. And of course, another kind of component to this is, you know, if we can reuse existing recommendations, for example, W3 standards or other existing schemas, and also possibly design patterns, which I'll talk about more when possible. So, you know, the FAIR principles, the Wilkinson 2016 paper really focuses a lot on RDF, which is kind of one of the main things, but it's not the only technology out there. But it is one way of achieving interoperability, which is kind of what the theme of this presentation will be based on. And finally, reusability in terms of vocabularies. So does it include more than just labels? So thinking back to the glosses terms, maybe it just has the labels, maybe we need more. Definitions, descriptors, comments, citations, all sorts of other things might be useful to include in a vocabulary too. It doesn't include links to other related terms. It may be indicating how they're related. If so, maybe even doing it with common syntaxes. So for example, one way of going about this, and I'll show examples of this, you know, is using OWL, Ontology web language, and using object properties from their relations to make connections between entities within a vocabulary to make them more broadly reusable. And again, it keeps coming back to this point. Do terms have unambiguous, globally identified unique identifiers like dereferenceable hierarchies, like a unique web link for a term so that you and everyone else knows exactly where to find it on the web. And hopefully it's got some annotations to tell you what it means. And finally, also linkages or mappings to other applicable vocabularies. If a vocabulary is, you know, exists in a silo, maybe it works for its purposes, but if there's other vocabularies that people are using and they're not connected together, then you kind of get to a dead end there. And so when different systems exist and they're broadly used, it's important to also build these linkages to help with reusability. Okay, so that's a bit of the theory stuff, and just coming back to the kind of general idea of semantics. So this slide, courtesy of Pierre, modified courtesy of Pierre Buttigieg, basically showing the semantic gradient, which, you know, kind of weaker to stronger semantics, which basically kind of shows the idea that on the one hand, you could have simpler things like glossaries, which just kind of show some terms and maybe some definitions, maybe a few other properties about them, all the way up to taxonomies, which have a hierarchy, and ontologies, which not only have a hierarchy, but also might have some lateral relations that again are expressed in some sort of more formalized system, like SCOS or OWL, et cetera, that allows to make these interconnections between the represented information. And this kind of helps with those qualified references to other metadata, which is discussed in the FAIR principles. So just a kind of an example of, not an example, but just kind of an overview. So when we say ontology, we mean a human and machine readable logical representation of real world information. So like a taxonomy, it can be hierarchically structured. So you could have a concept with its subconcepts and the various other children subconcepts, but it could also have lateral linkages that also connect it to other information. So it becomes like a knowledge graph, or it depending on your definition of that, but it's a graph of information and represented knowledge that can be queried using various technologies. And finally, they also include linkages to identifiers which are hosted on the web. So places that you can go and see them. And so everyone knows we're talking about the same thing. Okay, so that's a lot of theory, now a bit more practical. So within the biological and biomedical community, there are a whole bunch of different ontologies that are used. There's a whole bunch of different systems, different people are doing it. It's very difficult to standardize across all these things. And so one of the ones that has emerged and is something that is meant to work together by design is the Open Biological and Biomedical Ontology Foundry and Library. So the OBO Foundry for short. So maybe some people have heard of it from the gene ontology or the environment ontology, or the CHEBI, the chemical entities of biological interest. There are a lot more. There's hundreds of these ontologies actually. And in theory, they're all built to work together and follow common design principles and just overall be made to work together. So there are plenty of other ontologies that are not part of this, or other vocabularies that are not part of the OBO Foundry, but this is one place to look if you want to try and help coordinate on top of other things in a more meta-coordinated way, where hopefully we can all get our data working together through a unified knowledge model. So what's kind of important about this is that it's a collection of domain-specific interoperable ontologies. So the OBO principles, there are many of them, but basically they say, please reuse terms from other people, please don't reinvent the wheel, and please don't cover the same domain that someone's already doing so that we're duplicating effort. And so in this way, the theory is that, every domain, and we'll talk about the specificity of that later, but every domain should have at some point, if people are interested, in ontology representing it, and hopefully a user group of people who are contributing to that ontology to help add relevant information that's relevant to that user group, whatever their use cases various might be. So just an example of that here, I'm showing in this kind of concept map, just a few of the OBO ontologies which might be useful to people in this group. The environment ontology, which I'll discuss more later to represent environments, the plant ontology, the chemicals ontology, the ontology for biomedical investigations, the gene ontology, and the phenotype and trait ontology. And the whole point is that they're all kind of built to work together using common design principles and reuse tooling. Okay, so a little bit more about the environment ontology. So the environment ontology, ENVO, is a community ontology for the representation of environments, environmental materials, environment types, biomes, features, etc. I think Pierre has been on this call before, so I'm assuming some of you know him and may be familiar with him or some of his work. He's one of the, I would say he's the lead contributor to the environment ontology, but there are several of us who are trying to make this project happen. And the environment ontology started with genomics world to be the representation of the metadata that accompanies genomic sequencing data, but has evolved since. Now it has terminology relevant to a pretty large variety of domains, and we attempt to make it open source and allow people to add as they come. So some terminology that might be, so some domains that ENVO covers, microbial ecology, oceanography, cryospheric sciences, hazards and pollutions. We have some soil sciences, but could always be improved. And of course, it supports various use cases. I think Pierre would probably have some more examples of this, but he's been involved with some UN Environment Program and some other similar endeavors. But the most notable use case for ENVO would be the genomics community, as I mentioned, where it's used in the MIXS standards, the minimum information about NEX sequence standards, which are basically used to give contextual information to metagenomic data within, or genomic data within sequence repositories. But anyway, you can see here, ENVO, here's just a little snapshot of terms that we have, environmental materials that we have, and you can see that there's quite a large collection. They're linked together. I give some more examples of this, but you can see that there's a reasonable representation of some things that might be of relevance to various communities. Soils, liquefied hydrocarbon gases, all sorts of interesting things, formation fluid, radioactive materials, organic material, sand. There's a lot going on here. So there's just the things that popped up to the top of that figure. Okay, so a little bit more demonstration about just kind of showing how this is a good example of fair vocabulary ontology by the criteria that Mark and I had produced above. So in terms of findability and and whatnot, I stressed it's important to have a dereferenceable IRI. For a live demo, it will never, of course, work, but in theory, you go there, hopefully the page will resolve, and you actually can land somewhere and see things. Sometimes the server is being a little slow, so apologies. Shouldn't do things like that in a live demo. But anyway, the point is that it will resolve to it's a resolving IRI so that we can all get to it and our machine systems can get there as well. It's got a definition, which is using a standard. This is annotation property, so this is understandable to machines. This is something we might expect to see as a definition to describe it as such. It's got some synonyms, which again are following some other conventions from OBO. So for example, the PALSA has these synonyms. It's got some comments, which are again more descriptive information. So it's more than just a term label. It exists within a hierarchical grouping. So you can see here, these are subclass relations that we can help navigate our way down through our representation of things to get to something like PALSA. And it's got these term relationships, which are machine readable axioms, which are the linkages between concepts. So you can see here, this is the way that we can encode to machines the relationships between these items and make it kind of more into a graph. Sorry, if there were any questions, I'd be happy to take them now. If it's relevant, if you want to jump in. If not, I will just keep going. Okay, so moving on a bit to some soil-related content that might be helpful or that exists within ENVO that might be of interest to this community. So just kind of at the very top level, just kind of showing like some of the terms in ENVO. So here's our top level soil term. So it's defined as such: an environmental material primarily composed of minerals, varying proportions of sand, silt, clay, et cetera, et cetera. We've got some comments about it, and we have more of these linkages where we actually kind of help to formulate it to a graph so that one might be able to search for these things or discover things based on these relationships to represent that which exists. And you can see here we've got quite a lot of soil types, but I'm sure there's many more, and I'm sure this could use quite a lot of cleaning up. So anyway, but you can see here there's quite a lot of soil types that are represented in ENVO. Okay, a little more about parameters. I don't think we have total organic carbon yet, but we do represent some parameters of relevance to various disciplines, oceanography and perhaps terrestrial ecology, are interested in things like particulate organic carbon and nitrogen. So we've got representations of them as well, with definitions and some axiomatization, which we can help to link out to other ontologies here, for example, to the chemical entities ontology, KEBI, in this axiom where we go and link off to a term from KEBI here. So you can see within this hierarchy, we've got the particulate matter and then particulate organic matter and then carbon and nitrogen. So things like this, which might be helpful more broadly. This has been done in collaboration with Mark Schildhauser and work that he's done previously with NCES, the National Center for Ecological Synthesis, I believe. Might be wrong there. Anyway, but this is, we've various collaborators have helped to add these kinds of terms over the years to kind of help better represent things. And then some more parameters. So things like this, I know Kathy had asked specifically about density of soil or mass density, I believe. So we have some terms like that currently in ENVO. So for example, within our qualities hierarchy, there's the phenotypic and trait ontology, which is the OBO ontology for qualities. And we import that, and then we can put terms under it within ENVO to cover some of these types of things. So for example, mass density of soil, we've got some of the things here. And this is interesting. This is interesting because this is actually created using design patterns. And I can talk a bit more. I'd be happy to talk more about this idea. But basically, there are some tricks and tools that we can use to create regular formal semantics like this by using design patterns that are simplified within a tabular format. So for example, here we can create a term like mass density of soil simply by putting together various qualities. So for example, porosity or temperature, et cetera, with environmental materials such as soil or air. And so you can see here, by combining mass density and soil, we're actually able to use this to generate all of this, mass density of soil, et cetera, generate all of this term, the axiom, et cetera. So there's some interesting possibilities for automating the creation of certain patterns when a pattern exists. Okay, so a bit more about ontology design patterns, just kind of in general, if I didn't make it clear on the slide before. What these do is, I mean, at a very high level, a design pattern is any pattern that can be applied to help make an ontology. Usually what that means from a technical perspective is that we want to generate ontology classes from CSV files, which is like what I was showing here, but I'll give a little more example of that. There's two ways within the OBO tooling framework that this can be done. Our two main methods, there's probably more, but these are the two commonly used ones within the OBO paradigm. So there's one called robot templates, which I'll touch on later, which is one way of creating ontology terms from CSV files, from expert information, and get it to compile into the formats which are more machine readable. And there's the DOS-DP, the dead simple ontology design patterns. Either way, the idea is that we can take data that's formatted like this, following some sort of design pattern. It's in the tabular form, and we can generate OWL that's more expressive, more discoverable to machine systems, and also linking out and more interoperable. So linking out to other ontologies. So for example, KEBI for chemicals like nitrate, ENVO for materials like soil. And so we take information that's in a human kind of readable format, tabular format for editing, which people are more familiar with, and we can create the machine searchable readable vocabularies for the annotation and discovery of data. And I'd be happy to talk more about this, give more examples of this in the questions session. Okay, so another tool, like I mentioned, is the robot templates, which is another way of creating ontology terms from tabular data. It's also similar. There's some differences between these two systems, but I can touch more on that later if that's of interest to people. But the long and short is they both do this. They both help us to create terms from easier to use systems. This can also be done, of course, in Protégé, which is kind of an ontology editing tool, which is also commonly used within ontology development. I'm more of a fan of these types of things, but there's no right answer. Absolutely. So in order to kind of facilitate bulk requests within ENVO to make use of these tools and systems, I helped to create a collaborative workflow for ENVO contributions that uses one of these tools, the robot one that I mentioned previously. And basically the long and short is that this documentation is something that it was made for ENVO, but of course could be reused for other purposes, for other ontologies within or outside of OBO, kind of using standard tools and technologies that could be repurposed in a whole bunch of different ways. But basically what this workflow does is it guides users through the process of creating new terms within ENVO, which again could be applied elsewhere, and is intended for non-ontologists to kind of help the process of creating these terms and getting their expert, so your expert information, into a more formalized ontology-like system. So this particular workflow makes use of Google templates and kind of helps to organize requests in standardized sheets, and then gives the step-by-step instructions to fill out appropriate columns. And then, of course, it's got a protocol for ontologists to make sure that the whole thing compiles and be added to ENVO or to another ontology. So I'd be happy to talk more about this later, but this is a little bit more in the weeds. So I think I'll get through the rest of the presentation, and then we can maybe talk about this more later if this is of interest to people. Anyway, so coming back to kind of the main ideas. So from my perspective, working in this field as the ontologist for BCO-DEMO and kind of the work I've done for them, as well as various other projects, I see kind of several possibilities for how the soil informatics information cluster might be interested in going about things. And I'll give some kind of pluses and minuses to different scenarios. And I'm sure I'm missing some. So if anyone wants to chime in and we can have a discussion about this, I'd be happy to hear your thoughts. So one could always build a new ontology from scratch, a standalone project. It's a little bit harder to reuse existing tools that way. It's possible, of course. You would need, for example, URL server. There are possible workarounds for these things, like hosting it on BioPortal. You could make a standalone project that could work. A downside of this, so the upside is, one could design the whole thing from scratch without having to worry about other people's existing systems or, whatnot. The downside is if you do that, is you're not going to be interoperable or be able to work with anyone else's existing systems without extra work to map. So yeah, it's a lot of work to, for example, the ESIP semantic harmonization cluster has been working to align ENVO with SWEET, the semantic web earth entailment ontology, which some of you might be familiar with. And it's been a lot of work to just try and reconcile the two models and make their terminology actually be able to work together and be discoverable and used in machine systems. So I wouldn't recommend starting from scratch. I would recommend always reusing when possible. Yeah. And so the other possibility, which I'm more in favor of, is working within or into an existing knowledge and tooling ecosystem, for example, OBO, which I've been talking about previously. So this kind of thing doesn't have to be OBO, but within some existing system, OBO, SWEET, someone else. This helps to foster the FAIR principle of especially interoperability, that systems built to work together are much more likely to be interoperable than systems that don't know each other exist. And of course, this makes it a lot easier to reuse existing assets. For example, tools, like I mentioned before, there are several of these things. I'd be happy to talk more in depth about them. OBO community expertise, there are hundreds of these ontologies. There are dozens of developers, probably more than that, or from other communities, etc., who can be leveraged to help with these things. So in terms of if a cluster like this was interested in going down this route, following within an existing system, there are two possibilities that I could see coming of this. Either working off of an existing ontology such as ENVO and contributing terms directly to it, or creating a new OBO soil ontology that imports from ENVO and becomes a more domain-specific resource that is a branch off of ENVO. And of course, this would be more, these are just possibilities and suggestions. I'm not advocating for one thing or the other. I would say that I would not advocate for building from scratch. I personally would advocate for plugging into an existing tooling ecosystem like OBO. There are others that exist, but in terms of just the wide variety of knowledge represented and different disciplines and terminology from a lot of different things, I think OBO is your best bet. If anyone disagrees with that, I would love to hear about other better resources. But from my experience, this is the best kind of unified knowledge model. And then, if you were to go along those lines, it's totally up to, people within this community, how you'd want to go about doing that. If you want to have your terminology, be directly added to ENVO, which is kind of a general purpose environment project, or if you want to create something more specific, like an OBO soil ontology. There is some precedent for this. Again, this is not my decision to make. This has to be a community decision, but just a little bit of history here. So in the past, there have been several ontologies which have been spun off from ENVO. So for example, the food ontology, run now by a collaborator in British Columbia at the SFU, is an ontology for the categorization and handling of food products. And so originally some of these food terms were in ENVO, but it became quite a large chunk to handle. And so in following with the OBO principles of domain specificity, it was decided that it would be better for foods to be within their own ontology that would then import relevant terms from ENVO, and that could also be sending terms back to ENVO when needed, but that would kind of be its own thing, but interoperable with ENVO and the broader OBO Foundry. A similar thing happened with the agronomy ontology, which is the representation of agronomic practices, techniques, and variables, et cetera, was also kind of a spin-off from ENVO, sorry. And more recently, there's also been another ontology, the compositional dietary nutrition ontology, which was spun off from Foodon. So Foodon was, representing food was quite a large discipline to represent, and the dietary nutrition components of, what the foods actually can give your body, et cetera, was like scope for a whole nother, discipline, nutrition sciences. And so several of us helped to, from Food On, helped to create CDNO as a spinoff from there. So my point is that there is some precedence for these things, and it's all about building user communities and people who, with different expertise, who are willing to work together and add things together. So just a little bit more about the tools. If one was to go about creating a new ontology within the OBO Foundry, luckily we've got some really great collaborators who have made this easy for us. Sorry, should I just check the? Yeah, maybe we can. Can I answer those questions after? Maybe just I'll just finish this first. Okay, so for example, so coming back to this, so in order to make this process easier, the OBO Foundry, some of our developers created some tools that actually automate the process of creating a new OBO compliant ontology. And there's a tool called the Ontology Development Kit, which is quite nice. I've worked with it many times. For example, to create CDNO, which I mentioned previously. Anyway, so the point, I think the take home here is that, there are existing tools to do this if desired. That's what I'll say about this here. And then finally, just to kind of give like an overview of the different techniques which are used within various OBO Foundry ontologies. Like I mentioned previously, within ENVO, contributions are usually made either within Protege or with the new template workflow that I had previously described. But there are a variety of other ontologies within this Foundry, and they kind of have different tools and systems for adding terms and for maintaining their systems. So for example, the gene ontology, they have their own user interface, which is specific to the gene ontology, which curators from all over the world use to add their proteins and their genes to, which is kind of a huge endeavor, and they've got their own user interface and everything that goes with it. Another example of a way this is done within OBO that I'd like to bring up for the purposes of just so people are aware is the ontology for biomedical investigations. Yes, biomedical investigations is not exactly the focus of this cluster, but I think just the methodology here is what is important. So I just want to show that the way that OB does things, which is quite interesting, a little different than ENVO, is that they actually have a collection of modules. So these are kind of high-level groupings of terms that are all modularized and are contributed to using design patterns. So like I'd mentioned before, going from tabular formats to OWL, that is the way that OB is developed. And so the whole ontology, or basically all of it, most of it anyway, is organized into a set of modules, which are maintained through these TSV files, each of which follows different design patterns with pre-existing possibilities for axioms. And I can just show an example of how that works here. So if we just go to one of these modules, for example, devices, I'll show a little example of how it looks and how it's maintained. So here you can see a large TSV file. And basically what we're showing is the code that is used to create the ontology, the information that in a tabular format that's used to create a more expressive ontology. And so you can see, basically these are tabular formats which people might be a little more comfortable or working with rather than something like Protege. But anyway, so what we can see here is that for a given term, for example, mass spectrometry, or let's go with one of these. I believe mass spectrometry is the one I wanted to focus on. Yeah. So for a given term, we have columns within this CSV or TSV file that correlate to different annotation properties or axioms, various different extra information that we want to encode into our ontology. And so you can see here, for example, they define a label, they define a definition, they define a parent term or a subclass term, and they also can define their axioms. So for example, here there's an axiom for function. So one need only type measure function. And now we know that a mass spectrometer performs some measure function. Similarly, we can add things like, its constituent parts. So for example, they've added that, a mass spectrometer has part a mass analyzer, an ion source, and an ion detector. And when it's compiled together, it helps to create, it creates it also can create this more formalized representation of the information that is, in a graph space that's maybe a little easier to construct, in my opinion, although people might
could
not
you go
always
back
agree.
a slide there?
Yeah, absolutely.
So all of those terms that are in the cell, like mass analyzer, ion source, ion detector, those have to be terms that are already existing in the ontology, and you're putting them there. There's going to be a string match to an identified term on the ontology. Is that correct?
Exactly. Thank you for clarifying that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So so are you expecting to copy and paste from the ontology in there, to determine that things were, for instance, spelled correctly, or that they do exist exactly as typed in there in that cell?
Well, so yeah, so what happens, there are checks for this. So when you run the compile step, it'll say like, hey, you have an error, like mass analyzer wasn't found. And then you go look, and then you'll go type that string in, and you say, oh, I spelled it with an S instead of a Z, etc. So so it's just a little bit of a different way of doing it than within Protege. But the point that I want to highlight here is that the OB is quite a large consortium of people. They've got quite a lot of developers, quite a lot of use cases, and they've made this workflow work for them quite nicely. So I just wanted to bring this up for people to know about.
This is distinct from the ENVO robot template?
Right. So let me clarify a little bit more. So the robot template is the general purpose tool that can be used to do this type of thing. So it can be used in any different context. So a robot template doesn't even need to be used within an OBO ontology. It could be used anywhere, but different people are using them differently. So here, OB has a series of templates, like I'm showing here. So for assays, biopsies, devices, etc. And this is an example of theirs. Within ENVO, we've implemented a robot template as well, but that one is it's done a little bit differently in that the robot template is a temporary thing which disappears, and the ontology terms just get injected into the main OWL file. Whereas here, these are permanent standing robot templates. So CSV or TSV files that are existing within a GitHub repo that anyone can, or that any contributor can just go and add to, and that you maintain there as the source of truth rather than within Protege. So it's just a different way of going about things. Sorry if this is a little bit over the heads of people. I hope I'm not unclear here.
No, okay, thanks for clarifying.
Yeah, so anyway,
Kai, Sumit has her hand raised too, I see.
Yeah, so I think, no, please go ahead.
Just a quick follow-up on Mark's question. So in the has part, presumably, if this is also a way to add information. So if the mass analyzer doesn't exist, then you put it here, and then somebody figures out it doesn't exist, and somebody else has to add it.
Yeah, exactly. So usually the way this works within Protege when you're developing is you would type in has part some mass analyzer, and it all has to be done within Protege. This is simply another way of going about doing that. And of course, in order to make these relationships work, it has to be referenced to an actual existing term. So for example, if mass analyzer didn't exist within OB, it would get confused and complain and say like, we couldn't find that. What do you mean by that? And then you would have to go and create such a thing in order for this relationship to work. Did that help answer that question?
Oh yeah, sorry. I was nodding vigorously. That wasn't visible.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so and just briefly, just so people are can see, it does end up producing the same thing as would be done if in Protege, and it helps to at the high level get us from information that's in a tabular form, which we can all add to, which ends up being a graph like this that machines can search through. So that's kind of the important thing. So it'll have this hierarchy that'll get created, and it'll have these lateral relationships and properties, et cetera, that link out to other information to try and make things more standardized. So yeah, so these pre-existing terms, sets of axioms help simplify and standardize for any given term hierarchy. So that's the way that OB does things. ENVO does things differently. The gene ontology does things differently. There's no right answer. There are just less wrong answers. So anyway, I hope that helps. Sorry if this was a little bit high level and technical, but I'd be happy to clarify and go over anything. So thank you for your time, and I would love to answer lots of questions. Okay.
So Kai, thanks a lot for the presentation. And, indeed, I really think that what the OBO Foundry group is doing is really some great organization to create, very interoperable ontologies. So that's fantastic. You may be aware, and, since I come more from the environmental side, that, for instance, I interact with colleagues who are all about SOSA and SSN. I mean, they are all about it. In fact, I'm interacting with the guys who are the co-authors of the W3C recommendation on SOSA and SSN. So the design pattern that you were showing, which I don't know, we used to call it EQ, that inheres in. Do you also have a SOSA SSN compliant template for describing measurements? Because a lot of our concern on the soil ontology effort is, making the data fair, right? So the data are really largely, not exclusively, but largely the interest is in the measurements taken on soil.
Right.
And we've, this group has gathered a whole bunch of different soil data resources that all have, different ways of describing the same thing, or maybe they used even the same strings to describe things, but the underlying methodologies are different, right? And the way I think that a lot of people coming from the earth sciences, I mean, Simon Cox, for instance, very deeply involved with, the SOSA SSN way of looking at things. So I'm just wondering where the OBO Foundry group stands on, accommodating that W3C recommendation for interoperability of observations and measurements.
That's a great question. I don't have a very satisfactory answer for you, other than we are committed to just trying to map out, as everyone has time and as possible. We also follow like I'd mentioned before previously with the measurements, we kind of follow some design patterns. So things like this, for example, that help to create, it's one way of creating these kind of formally represented semantics, to give us these axioms that within this is one way of doing it within the OBO paradigm. Yes, you're right. There's different ways of doing it within SOSA SSN. So kind of twofold answer here. I think that some of these tools, I'm not sure about the DOSDP tool, this one that, the robot template for sure, I think could be used to create SOSA-like terminology or follow SOSA's patterns, because it's a very general purpose tool. It's not specific to OBO. The other one, DOSDP, I'm not sure if that would work, but I'd be happy to try it, and we could.
Well,
we could see.
if your robot template could make these sorts of measurements, like the one that we talk a lot about is soil bulk density, right? And I think one of your slides even kind of, alluded to a little bit of, I think that in ENVO, it's called mass density.
Yes.
Right. And I think that you've got, mass density of soil.
Yeah. So
right?
here was one of the examples. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And it's got an exact synonym of soil mass density. Unfortunately, the notion of bulk density is, I don't think, currently in ENVO. And if we were to put it in to ENVO, which I think would be a great place for it, it would also be nice if there was a SOSA style axiomatization of it. Because a lot of these people, like a lot of soil scientists, they're coming out of agencies like, federal agencies like USGS or USDA or Cicero in Australia, etc. And they are, they kind of need to comply at this higher level which seems to be, going in the direction of W3C standards, right?
Mhm.
So, I don't want you to get lost in some of the things. What I'm saying is, I think this is a great framework, but there are competing representations that are very important
Mhm.
to certain groups of stakeholders. And, if there was some, especially in terms of the design pattern for observations and measurements.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so what I'm just showing here is just kind of some of the tools and techniques. I absolutely understand that, some of these other, like SOSA might be another good place for this, if a soil ontology is created to be, linked to and exist within that framework.
Well,
Unless-
we aligned those standards in the past. So when you look at that equivalent class there, mass density and adheres in some soil, in SOSA world, we would say that the feature of interest is soil and the observed property was mass density. So it's really close. I mean, the EQ model is, and you've probably seen that big map that we aligned EQ and Saranto and OBO and SOSA. So I guess I was just mainly asking, are you guys aware of the fact that there's a lot of people using the SOSA SSN, and are you kind of trying to accommodate it with your template? I think it's a low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, no, in theory, it might very well be. I'm not sure because so when you have a design pattern like this, which is very simple, proper, like quality or attribute, whatever you want to call it, and characteristic or entity or whatever you want to call it, then it's just the link between the two of them. That's fairly easy to do. But when it's something a little more complicated, it might not always be a one-to-one mapping. So I'm not sure what the best answer there is.
So I think that I've got a follow-up question related to Mark. When I was listening to you talk, one of the things that I'm starting to struggle with is how to represent things like sample collection and various methodologies. So for bulk density, for example, sieving the soil or drying the soil in different methods really impacts whether or not the data is interoperable. And it's not quite clear to me how you would represent those methodological differences that are essentially doing a mass per volume, just in different components in this framework.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So this framework is not doing that. That can be done in other ways though. So for example, like OB, like I mentioned, the reason I chose measurement devices in the example is because that might be something that you would analyze some of your data with. So maybe you got your chlorophyll measurements, your whatever, using a mass spec or a liquid chromatograph, etc. So within your data, you could mark them up with the term that exists from ENVO or some similar soil ontology, Prov, SOSA, et cetera, whatever it ends up being. So you could say like, this is the concentration of chlorophyll A. And then you could have another place in your database, RDF store, whatever data your system or your use case is using, that gives you like something like a measurement device. So this is chlorophyll A with a mass spec, or this is chlorophyll A with a satellite.
So you would essentially register the methodologies as a device in this case, or as
that would be one way of using these types of ontologies within an RDF triple store or a database to encapsulate more of that information. Like I said, though, there's no right answer. There's just a set of ontologies that work interoperably to try and facilitate people like you doing that. But how you go about doing that is up to you.
Okay.
So for example, with my work at BecoDemo, we're kind of using a hybrid of ENVO and NERC, which is the one of the larger marine ontology systems. And it's basically like, we allow our data managers to, say like, oh, this is concentration of chlorophyll A in water, and it was measured with, one of these parameters, and we're this certain about it. And all of that kind of gets written out to an RDF data store in the end.
Okay. I think Kathy has a question.
Yeah, I guess it relates to the fact that there are, so many efforts with respect to trying to develop ontologies. Is that, and when you're building it, it's maybe not fair to ask, but how do you measure the sort of like the uptake of the ontologies that do get built? Like, how do you, is there data on, how much ENVO is used or applied? Is it easy to get at?
Well, the difficulty in that is people don't always report when and how they use it. So for example, ENVO is very widely used for the annotation of genomic data. But beyond that, it's hard to know, so there's several efforts that, like for example, Pierre's engaged with, myself more engaged with. It's being used in a variety of user groups, but actually getting all those statistics is difficult. The only statistics that we really have are like the MixS usage data, how often things are used within the genomic sequence repositories, how well annotated those are. So we have that kind of data. I think the gene ontology might have some similar data. There's also the OBO dashboard, which is a system that basically, it's in progress, but basically it shows how well used the OBO ontologies are used within each other and how well they conform to the standards.
Yeah.
So there's some sorts of information, but again, it's really difficult because if someone's using this in their database and they just publish it in a paper, we don't necessarily know that. I mean, you could go and look through the citation links, but then it's hard to know. You always find things that you don't know about.
Yeah.
Kai, do you know if they use any link analysis like Google Analytics on the Perl URIs or anything like that, just to figure out traffic as a proxy for usage, perhaps?
I haven't ever done that. I'm sure that could be done though. That's a good point.
Okay, thanks.
Kathy, it is a good question. I just wanted to pipe in. I think, coming from the Ecological Synthesis Center here in the US, we do consider ENVO to be, one of the really major players that there's a sustained effort involved in it. There's kind of it's an open collaboration as well. So, just the idea that it's established, it's got some really good knowledge modelers who have consistently been involved with it. It's a lot, more robust than many of the alternatives. And in fact, within ESIP itself, there's a major harmonization effort going on between ENVO and SWEET, where you might have heard of SWEET. It's the Semantic Web for the Earth Sciences Ontology. SWEET is massive in its scope, but it doesn't have nearly the level of detail on environmental phenomena that ENVO has. So I think that if you were looking for, an environmental ontology, ENVO would be the first place, I would say to look, for sure. And that's kind of the buzz, at least in the ecological community, that I'm familiar with.
Right. Yeah, I guess there's two parts to, there's uptake as to who is actually using it. And then I guess, what would you say, as it's then the perception of the ontology as being a good, a good, I guess, I don't know, a good one to recommend. Right.
Yeah.
So
go ahead, Kathy.
Coming from the soils community and computational soils, the community is almost completely unaware of the existence of ontologies. That you might get some folks who are aware of controlled vocabularies and lists, especially out of the major regional database or regional soils group centers like NRCS or CISRO or the FAO. But for the most part, this whole concept of annotating your data with a common with a common framework and interactive vocabulary is not something that's really done in the field yet.
Ooh.
Yeah.
It's really exciting, right?
And then there are other metadata standards, like there's some, GCMD and CF metadata. And at ESIP, there's been a lot of discussion with the developers and maintainers of those to become more semantic. And but it's a slow process. And if you're not working in I would say the kind of atmospheric, and kind of big agency standards area, if you're more of a field biologist, I think ENVO is your best home. But there are other standards, and hopefully when those do become more semantic, they'll be harmonized with ENVO, as I expect to be the case.
And I'm not advocating for the use of ENVO. I'm actually just trying to show different things. Sorry, I didn't mention Provo and SOSA those would be good examples of non-OBO ontologies. I'm actually more in favor personally of making a branch off of ENVO, a spinoff for soil, which has its own dedicated user group and community, but makes use of the expertise and knowledge from ENVO and OBO in general. That would be my suggestion. But again, that's up to people to decide.
You know, and one of the reasons people are reluctant to get into ENVO, this is not me personally, but some of my other close colleagues, aside from people like Kai or Pierre, is that you have to adhere to this whole upper ontology, this BFO upper ontology, which a lot of people look at it and go, I don't agree with it, and it doesn't make sense. It's either I don't agree with it or I don't even understand what the hell they're talking about. And yet that's at the top of, you know, looming above you in terms of what I found is that it doesn't really impact your daily life.
No, not at all.
As a scientist. But there's some people who philosophically, you know, are repulsed by committing to that ontological organization.
Right. I see it as a very philosophical thing that is in practice, in my opinion, kind of meaningless. So I think as long as there's kind of like some idea, you know, differentiation between some very specific upper levels, like a process is different than an entity, like, you know, a physical thing, or like a color or quality or an attribute is different than a, you know, like, again, a physical thing. Like, to me, that's all that really matters. So I don't care about Buffo in as much as that, as there's a few terms from it that, you know, I anchor at and that we anchor at, and that's, I think, what's important. And I think that too much discussion at the philosophy of like how you model those things is, to me, irrelevant. I could be wrong, but it's not practical or useful in any way, in my opinion.
Yeah, so you should then slice it off, Kai. Yeah, and just start at the level where scientists care.
Right. So actually, that's what I did with the crop and dietary nutrition ontology, which I mentioned briefly. I actually engineered it such that it starts at a specific hierarchy. So it follows Buffo, but it doesn't start all the way at the top. It doesn't start up in independent continuum. It starts basically like something like measurement device or device.
Yeah, so then you can wear it like a hat, like the whatever top level thing. So you can switch the hats off.
Yeah. So.
Huh.
Thank you, Kai. I think this was sort of a really excellent level to pitch this at for the cluster, and really fascinating to think about doing.
Great. Well, I hope that's helpful. Please reach out if you need anything more, or if you are curious. Like I said, I'm not advocating for anything in particular. I just think that people should reuse and, if possible, make it work with other existing systems and coordinate that way.
Fantastic. All right, so I'm going to stop the recording.